on a very practical level, yes, the football players in the game, the in-game football players, they have a lot of qualities like strength, shooting power. Are they a team player or not? And they get scores on all these different characteristics. And the people in the industry say all these scores are based on the data that we receive from the football clubs, for example. So it's objective. There is no racial bias. There are no stereotypes involved.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen.
Okay, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest. From my own home country, from the Netherlands. Jacco, please introduce yourself.
Yes, hello, Maurice, and hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Jacco van Sterkenburg. I'm indeed a Dutch person working at a Dutch university, Erasmus University. I live in Utrecht myself with my family, 2 children. And I think I've been asked on the podcast also for my work on race, racism, inclusion, and to also discuss a little bit more the trajectory that's resulted in the work that I'm doing. Basically, my life story, in a way, is not. I would say not that interesting, but we'll see what happens in the podcast. Maybe it's interesting after all. But I say this because um, I haven't been like a person traveling all over the world so far, even though my research interest is very much on similarities and differences amongst cultures, how to understand each other better. Even though that's the case, and even though I have, of course, traveled around, but I would say just not as much as maybe you would expect, given the research topic I'm interested in. Also, myself, I'm a white Dutch man doing research on racism. Means that I am very much aware of potential blind spots I have myself on this topic. I am not the one experiencing racism in my own society, the Netherlands, which is a white dominated society, right? So basically, I am part of the group that is the norm, you could say. Um, Being part of the group that's basically not discriminated based on race or gender or sexual orientation. So I'm really, in that sense, a privileged person in the society. So that's I'm also saying this to make clear that um, even though I may not, like I said, do not travel around the world that much, I do have a very diverse research team around me to keep me always attentive to what is happening. And this research team that I work with basically on a daily basis is coming from all over the world. So basically, I have brought the world inside in my work group, and I'm very happy with that. It's a very nice group of people. So I'm fortunate to have the international surrounding just very close to me, basically in Rotterdam where I work. But we may discuss this a bit more in depth later on. I do this work on race inclusion and especially media and sports because that's my particular, you could say, the particular case studies that I'm looking at. I find sports very interesting because sport is very diverse in terms of race, in terms of gender. Maybe there's no other platform you could say that, maybe apart from music, for example, where you see so much diversity on the screen, on the one hand, and on the other hand, which is seen by so many people at the same time. Sport contests, when you have a football World Cup and Olympic Games, it's attracting so many viewers, young people, older people. So I think this combination makes it a very interesting case study for me so far to study race and ethnicity. Well, first of all, because of the basically the diversity that it shows. Second of all, because of the popularity of it across the world, you could say. So yeah, that's probably something that we discuss a bit more.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that part of the conversation, Jacco. I mean, you and I, we met for the first time in Sweden, actually, although, we're both from the Netherlands. We met in Sweden during the Inner Development Goal Summit. So I hope we will touch upon that as well, why you were there and how that relates with the work that you're doing. Um, but, trying to figure out, why did you end up where you are today? Tell us a bit. So you live in Utrecht now. Were you born there as well? Were you part of a big family, small family? And did you do yourself a lot of sports? So yeah, can you maybe shed some light on that?
Of course, yes. So let me just start at the beginning. So I was born in the Netherlands, but in the north, Assen, which is kind of the capital of one of the provinces. But it's a relatively small city. I was born into. I'm the oldest of, and I have a younger brother. So we were with four. My parents now are divorced already for some time now. Uh, but but I was, yeah, I grew up in a very, yeah, how could I say this, very encouraging family. They always encouraged me to go and explore basically the world, but also to explore my interests. For example, when I started my studies, I remember at the time, well, let me start with high school. So when I moved, I only lived in this capital of Drenthe. The city is called Assen, this small city. I moved there to 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 the area of Rotterdam when I was about 4 or 5 years old, so on a very young age. And then also I went to high school in Rotterdam, which was at the time, I remember this was one of the one of the first important moments, I think, in my life, because for the first moment, for the first time, I moved out of my familiar environment. Contrary to all my classmates, I didn't go to high school in my village where I lived, close to Rotterdam. Uh, all my friends went there, but I went to what we then called the big city, Rotterdam, which was, it's not such a big city worldwide, but still for the Netherlands, second largest city. And I went there by myself, so not any of my friends went there. It was gymnasium. It's in Dutch. It's kind of an independent school. Higher educated young people could go there. I think my parents at the time thought this was a good idea because I had quite good grades at school, and but for me it was more like, okay, now I have to go to the big city, which was also something that made me more aware of the diversity, which of course is nowadays one of my research topics: racial diversity, ethnic diversity. In a city like Rotterdam, which is one of the most diverse cities in the world, um, given the different ethnic groups. I mean, even though it's not so big, and especially not on a world scale, it is very diverse on a world scale. If you look at all the different groups, it made me very much aware of diversity when I started there. So, coming from a white village and a white family, moving to this very diverse city made me aware of diversity. And I think it then triggered also my interest in how 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 can we live together in this, yeah, multi-ethnic city, and basically in this multi-ethnic world and society. So I think then at an age of 12, 13, when I moved to Rotterdam, then it's already started this process. Also, what happened then was that I was the village, the small village boy, basically. I
Mm.
mean, the others had much more street credibility, like coming from the big city, and me coming from a smaller village felt sometimes an outsider. So even though I am part of the norm in terms of my race, my gender, at that moment, I realized, well, actually, I am now not so much part of the norm. I'm an outsider because people, yeah, other classmates had much more knowledge on what city life means, and I was pretty shy, and it felt like, okay, now I'm not really part of the dominant
Mhm.
group anymore for the first time in my life, basically. So I think that was a big shift for me. I think it in the end it was a good transition because it made me more aware of, yeah, of the diversity that that you find in the world basically, but also in bigger cities on a young age, and then moving on to in the end to Utrecht after my high school studies in Rotterdam, moving to Utrecht where I studied my study psychology,
Hmm.
especially with a specialization in cross cultural psychology. So I really on purpose chose a specialization that was interested in diverse cultures and inter-ethnic understanding, you could say. So I was on purpose choosing that path, and I'm basically still working in that area, you could say,
Hmm.
even though the sports and the media part only came later. But you know, so
So
that's kind of how my trajectory went.
yeah, Jacco, if you, because you mentioned, um, when you were in Rotterdam, you were much more exposed and aware of, the diversity, that particular environment. Um, is When you think back, was there maybe a particular moment or experience that made you aware and more curious about, oh, this is something that I want to pursue and understand more about, these differences?
I think that's it was not so much something or one moment that kind of triggered me to become interested in studying diversity. Or it was more probably on an unconscious level that I noticed that in some circumstances you can feel like an outsider basically. And I felt that especially in the first year there, like I said, coming from the village with people who were much more um yeah like streetwise, you could say, in the city. So that awareness of being an outsider, I think that's kind of um, on the one hand interested me, even though it was not a pleasant feeling at all. And in many respects, I was still very privileged and very much part of the normal group. But yeah, I think in that moment in time, I realized that for some, it's even much more the case that they are an outsider, and I think that's remained with me, that kind of awareness. Um,
So if you're saying it was not a pleasant experience, can you give an example of that then?
yes, it's what I remember from that period is that that I had the feeling that I was not always, how should I say, I had friends, so I wasn't definitely was I was definitely not alone there, but I did feel that at some moments, others did not take me that seriously somehow for lacking in that, what I now call city credibility, or however you want to call it, because I was raised in a quite in a protected
Hmm.
environment. Also, my family was quite of a protective environment. Going to the elementary school very close to my home, it was a very protective environment, and I think that some people didn't take me. I felt at least that they didn't take me that seriously when I moved to this wider environment, and
Hmm.
that that doesn't feel pleasant if you're not taken seriously by some, right? And it's not their fault. I mean, it's how it is. But I did feel, and that was not that pleasant.
And so when you went to Utrecht to study psychology, um, was that also in the back of your mind in terms of, I want to study something, understand more, so, you know, to ensure that others will not experience what I experience? Was that part of it? Or, yeah, what was the main drive for going in that direction of psychology? Um,
Yeah. So in general, I think when you are as young as, let's say, 17 years, 16 years of age, and you have to choose a university study, I think for many it's almost impossible. And it was the same for me because I was in a process of identity formation. I was thinking about who am I? What do I like in this world? What do I want to pursue? And then you have to suddenly choose a university study, which in your view at that moment in time is an important choice because you think this will also end up in maybe my career. So and so what I did, I just chose something bit random. I chose not psychology first. I chose more governmental studies
Okay.
in Leiden, actually. At the time, I went there, but I only it only lasted for, I think, for a few days, because I remember that when I got there and they explained, like the teacher or the professor at the time, or the dean of that faculty, explained to all the first year students what it would mean, this study for the coming 4 years. Yeah, in that moment in time, I think it was even the first day, I thought, well, this is not for me, actually. So I
Mm.
realized, well, I'm not going to do this for 4 years. It's not the path I want to pursue. Like I said, I had a family that always encouraged me, and that the same thing applied here, because I came
Mm.
home. I remember I came home. I said, well, because I lived still at home. I had already an apartment, but I had to wait for a few months to get in there in Leiden, in that city. I came home and I said, well, I'm not sure. And my parents were again encouraging, yeah, if you don't like it, what do you like then? What would you like to do? And then psychology came up in Utrecht. And the reason was that, I think, especially given the age, and the process of thinking about who am I, what is my identity, all these questions, I was struggling with that a little bit. Psychology at least seemed interesting because it may have provided answers. It didn't in the end, because it's just an academic study. It is not about me as a person. But I thought, well, maybe I can learn from that study, also about things about myself. And so yeah, I read the book that they had in the first term there, and it attracted me. So yeah, then I started studying psychology. And after that, quite soon after that, I did follow courses on more cross-cultural, intercultural psychology, which even more attracted my interest. And yeah, and then from there onwards, I never stopped
Mm.
working on those topics. But yeah, but it took a little bit of shifting for
So it
me in the beginning.
ultimately turned out to be, a good choice, right? Because you kind of are still working within that area. You mentioned in the beginning that you work especially in the field of media, sports. Um, how did that come about? And what are you actually doing there?
Yeah, so the sports focus came about in the end of my study psychology. So I did already, like I said, I already chose this focus on diversity, the cross cultural psychology, as it was called at the time. Now it's called differently, but it had to do with understanding different cultures better. And also it's a psychology study, right? So it was also about how, in clinical psychology, for example, when there are clients from another culture, how can you help them better? Because a lot of the much of the psychological literature was based still on Western white um, clients, basically, and also many of the trials or the experiments were based on working with white students, often from the US. So I mean, the whole idea of this cross cultural psychology was, but how does it work for people from other cultures, and from also non-Western cultures? So that was my interest already, starting, let's say, in the third year of my studies of psychology. And then in the fourth, fifth year, I started focusing on sport. But it was a coincidence, because I was just looking for an internship, and it was a newspaper ad that I saw in the university newspaper, small ad. I should have I should have kept it, because this coincidence changed completely my career and basically my life, because from then onwards, I never stopped doing particularly that type of research on sports and diversity. It was just a very small ad, I think 5 sentences. We are looking for an internship student who wants to work on, in particular, gender in sports media. and race was more on the sides, right? Was more on the margins. And it was not in my own faculty at the time, but in another faculty. So I went there, and then I had an interest more in race rather than gender, and so that's how. So the thing is, my that's maybe why I said in the beginning it's not so interesting. It's also based on coincidence. I mean, I saw this ad just as a coincidence. Of course, it attracted me. That's not a coincidence. I mean, it really kind of came at the right moment for me, and somehow it triggered my interest. Of course, that's not a coincidence, but the fact that it was there and that it was available, because this type of research is it's very rare, especially back then in the Netherlands, like that you could work on sports and media and gender and race. It, the US was more a country to go to if you wanted to do this type of research. There's a longer tradition there. There's a longer tradition also in a country like England. The Netherlands, not much, almost nothing. But yeah, two professors were working on it. I started working with them, and they became my supervisors at the time. So I learned a lot from them, and they looked at this phenomenon from a from a critical perspective, which to me was very interesting, because what I mean with critical perspective is it was not so much looking at sports media as something that unites people. It does unite people. If there's a World Cup match, people get together and it can unite people, and that's great. And sport can do that. But it also looked at the downsides of that, like the also the racism, the sexism that takes place there. And this is also, of course, very relevant still nowadays, given the online domain and the social media. A lot of also online hate messages are visible there. So they looked at it from a more critical lens, and that I think, to me at least, was a very interesting, and in the Netherlands at that a moment in time, a relatively new thing. So that's was when it started.
No, I think, I also quite a lot of younger listeners to this particular podcast, and you were saying, it's not that interesting. I do think it's interesting for a lot of young folks in terms of, don't worry too much. Ultimately, things will, you might find your way, right? Not everything needs to be planned. Sometimes, you go with the flow. I mean, and yeah, it's one comment you made is when you're young, you don't know what to do. So yes, I think you're right. For the majority of younger folks, finding out what they want to do in their lives is a difficult one. But don't worry too much. See it all as part of a learning process, which you did, and then ultimately you will be able to find your way. I think that's definitely what I hear. And you you ended up in a working in a field that's extremely interesting. I don't know if you mind me pushing you in a little bit in that direction, and that is about because that's how we started to discuss when we were in Sweden, is about gaming, and because that's something that you're also doing research on, and I'm really fascinated by that, um, because I think games are often seen as entertainment, but I think your work suggests that they are powerful narratives, uh, in the world, and they can shape ideas about identity, race, hero, villains, etc. So I don't know if you mind, but I would like to hear from you. What are you actually doing there, and yeah, tell a bit about more about that.
Yes, no, thank you for that question. So the thing is that my interest in the research I'm doing, and has always been the case, is in parts of popular culture that have a lot of impact on people. And and gaming is one of these phenomena that have a lot of impacts on people. And I'm especially interested in those domains that often academics have overlooked. So somehow it started in my case with like football on television, and meanings given to gender, race, disability as well. So I noticed that it was overlooked by academics, especially in Europe, I must say. And that it has, but at the same time, yeah, sports media has a lot of impact on people. It's a learning site, even though it's an informal learning site. But many people learn a lot by watching sports. And then when I have had finished that research trajectory, I wanted to find another domain which has a lot of impact. And then gaming, for me, was a very logical um yeah thing to examine more in depth, because if we look at gaming, it's a very powerful industry. It attracts a lot of young people. I I'm still interested mainly in meanings given to race, ethnicity, diversity, and I'm especially still also interested in sports. So I'm interested in particular in sports games, football games, like the so-called FIFA game. And this is a new research strand that I started. Actually, my the PhD candidate in my project, my recently funded project, just started this Monday, like yesterday. I had my first conversation with her today. So it's now
Mm.
starting for the coming 4 years.
Okay.
And basically, the idea is to indeed look at the industry. How do they think about diversity? Do they think about it at all? Because for them, a lot of the things that they are doing, it's data driven, and data, they say it's always objective. But um, that's a question that we wanna deal with, because um, on a very practical level, yes, the football players in the game, the in-game football players, they have a lot of qualities like strength, shooting power. Are they a team player or not? And they get scores on all these different characteristics. And the people in the industry say all these scores are based on the data that we receive from the football clubs, for example. So it's objective. There is no racial bias. There are no stereotypes involved. At the same time, a few studies have been done that say, well, maybe there are some stereotypes. It's not really that the industry can help it, but everybody has stereotypes. And yeah, these scores, even though they come from the clubs, from the football clubs, maybe, still they're being discussed internally.
Sure.
And there's an internal discussion on how these scores get distributed. And in that process, that's still a human process that's taking place. So there, we want to, yeah, we want to look into that process if they allow us, right? Because that's the question. The industry should hopefully cooperate with us on that. We want to ask questions like, are you aware of the diversity that is there in your game?
Mm.
Is it a topic of discussion for you within the industry? How do you deal with that? So that these are questions that we want to ask them, and we hope for cooperation. And we want to simply also look at the content of the games, like how are players represented, and do we see certain stereotypes? I mean, we know that a lot of times the black athletes are seen as physical, but um, less skilled in the management or intellect kind of domains. That's a stereotype that we see in research coming back. It's a prejudice, but it's a very stubborn one that we have seen, and it doesn't really change much over time. So I'm curious to see whether games either reproduce these stereotypes, or maybe they are a platform that challenge these stereotypes, and maybe they are an example for more inclusionary practices. So that's the
Mm.
question that we wanna answer there. So yeah,
Okay.
that's the gaming research I'm about to start now.
And that sounds very interesting. And maybe as part of the preparation for you, you came to the Inner Development Goal Summit, I think, with a very concrete question in mind, whether inner development goals could help shape gaming narratives. Did I understand it correctly? And if so, what sparked that interest, and what did you see or heard at the summit that stayed with you?
Yeah, so the summit in Stockholm, where we met in October, I think it was. Um, for me, it had two. Yeah, there were two reasons for going there. The first reason was not related so much to my gaming research; it was more related to my role in my own university as impact lead. I'm the academic impact lead, as they call it, which means that I think everywhere in the world, but especially also in Europe nowadays, universities are interested in how can we cooperate with society, and what is our impact. And in my role as impact lead, I'm continuously thinking about how we can do better in that regard as a university, but also how can we teach our students to become impactful in society. And for that role, the inner development goals can be really relevant. So one of the questions that I had when coming to Stockholm was, how can the inner development goals, how can they potentially be integrated in our education, um, to help students reflect on themselves, to help students reflect on their own learning process. After all, the inner development skills, they're also about self-reflection, thinking about yourself, but in the end also connecting with others and then taking action. I mean, there are different steps. I'm not an expert so much on inner development goals, to be honest, but the students can benefit from that. That was the first question. Then the second question that I had when coming to the IGG summit was, how can it be applied potentially to anti-racism interventions? Because in the end, in the gaming industry, one of my ideas is also to make people more aware where it's necessary. Maybe they are already aware. We'll see. But if it's necessary, make them more aware, and maybe make them more also giving them tools to make the gaming world more inclusionary. And an intervention like this is a conversation that I hope to have with these developers, with these game developers. And in that conversation, I think I can use some of the IDG insights. Um, After all, IDG is also about connecting with people, but it's also about making people more reflective of themselves and making them more reflective of maybe their own assumptions that may be biased, right? Like we all have our biases. So in that sense, those two questions, one as an academic impact lead and one as a researcher in the field of gaming, those two questions were important for me when coming to Stockholm. Um, yeah, and what in the end, what it brought me was, um, uh, yeah, quite a lot in the sense that it was a completely unexpected conference for me. It's not like an academic conference; it's completely different. Um, it was more a conference that took me out of my comfort zone here and there. I remember we had this practice where we had to look each other in the eyes for 1 minute or 2 minutes. Yeah, that's something you never do in an academic conference. That's yeah, completely weird if you would. But anyway, it yeah, I mean, we were doing this practice and it resulted in a conversation in the end and in also in a way in this podcast. So in in a sense, I felt it was a different conference for me. It made me connect to some people, which was really nice. I also felt that some of the goals, like especially the self reflective part and encouraging that in other people, is useful for also anti racism interventions, for example, but also for students in our education. So we do intend to implement some of that in our teaching. I also felt at the same time that a lot of emphasis was placed upon the individual and developing as an individual. Yeah, and not so much emphasis was on the more the structural side of things, like the societal obstacles, you could say, that hinder people in their development.
Yeah.
Um, and some people are just experiencing more obstacles than others based on their race, on their gender. And that part was not so much there, I thought. So I was also critical at the same time. Yes, it's good the different like goals. You can say, I think better, Maurice. What's like the thinking, the connecting, the acting. It's very good as an individual to reflect on these. And I know that it's not only the individual; it's also on a community level and even on a societal level that you can reflect on them and get better in that. But not everybody has the same starting position.
Mm.
And I think more attention could be placed on that in that conference. But anyway,
Yeah.
that's
No,
so that's a
and just
critical note.
for the listeners, also one of the challenges or critique points, of course, is that by I think this was the third or fourth time that the Inner Development Goal Summit was organized. It was in Sweden. You know, that alone has a result in a particular audience, because not everybody in the world can fly to Sweden because it's not cheap, and especially um, due to changes that are going on in the development world, especially where there is less money available. I think the audience was more Western than anything else. Um, and then the inner development goals is also sometimes that framework is criticized by the fact that it has been developed by Swedish white men. Um, so I mean, I do think your observation is correct. I do want to piggyback a little bit further on the inner development goals. If you look at capacities like empathy, critical thinking, awareness, uh, relationality, how then might games be designed differently if you keep that in mind? And what would actually change in storylines, characters, or players' choices? And I know, you just started the research, but I, yeah, my assumption is that you have some hypothesis around those things, right? What could happen, or yeah, can you maybe respond to that?
Yes, no, of course. That so the like the skills like self-reflection, awareness, critical reflection that are part of these IDGs, they can make people in the industry, and that applies to the gaming industry, but I would say to any industry, it can help them become more self-reflective. Why is this important? I think it's important because similar to the IGG summit itself, really becoming aware of racial inequity or the subtle racisms that exist, really becoming aware of it means um, that you have to like almost train your muscle. Like when you go to this to the fitness school, you have to train you want to train your muscles to get stronger. The same applies to racial consciousness, especially for a white person. And you mentioned like that in the summit of the IGG, it's mainly white Swedish men developing it. And if the audience also is mainly white, then the problem with that is that people tend to stick with the same narratives. And maybe a racial justice or racial inequity, yes, it's an important term, but it's not felt, and it becomes more an empty term. The only way to change this and to give really to really kind of know what it means is to either talk to different people who do experience racism and then become self-reflective and to thereby train that muscle. That it's a, I always see it as a muscle. If I don't speak to people who experience racism, if I do not read literature on this for let's say 2 months, my muscle is not there anymore, and I tend to go with the normal flow of things, which for me is very easy because I'm in a situation where I'm not bothered by any form of discrimination. So I don't notice it anymore. I don't notice it, and I think this is the problem also in the potentially in the gaming industry, which is dominated, especially behind in the development phase by white men. And I'm not saying that white men are wrong or anything. No, it's not like that. But it's the fact that they are not experiencing themselves these forms of discrimination, that they have blind spots, and you have to train that muscle to also to in the end become aware of these blind spots. And you have to train it not one day, not by reading one article. You have to basically do it continuously. And I think the IGGs, if you do it on a permanent basis, if you implement them, but I'm not specifically meaning here the IGGs. I mean in general more the self reflection because I don't yeah I don't know enough of the IGGs to only position them there, but in general, self reflections, racial consciousness, yes, if you do it on a permanent basis, it's necessary to keep that muscle strong of self reflection. And yeah, I noticed it myself. I think as an academic, if I would be in a management position for years and not read anything about racism and not speak and mainly be in a white bubble, mainly some diversity, but mainly white, I think I would yeah, my muscle would become weak, let's say, and I would have because as a white person, it's so easy to just go with the flow and not think about these things. I think that's the problem in general
Mhm.
in many of the industries or maybe even countries. dominated by one particular homogeneous group that is dominant, that this muscle is not trained sufficiently. And then people don't see it anymore. They don't
Uh-huh.
see the problem anymore. And there actually is a problem, but they just don't see it. So these IgG goals or similar goals like that can have a real function as long as they're used on a permanent basis, not just once, and then have that conversation with each other.
I really resonate with the comparison with the muscle. And that you have to train and well, if you look at the physical aspects of it, if you compare it with that, I've been out of the Netherlands for quite a number of years, for the last 30 years or so. And, I grew up like you with being on a bicycle every day. And that's not the case anymore. So, but when I'm back for the summer in the Netherlands, I think I can still cycle, for a lot of kilometers. But after a half an hour, I feel a lot of muscles that I haven't used for a lot of years. So, and I do think you're absolutely right. That's also happening in terms of inner development skills, like empathy and etc. And then maybe it gets even more difficult the older you get, because there are a lot of assumptions that you have. Um, but if you don't train yourself and experience it, that's a problem. I would like to go to walking muscles that you use for walking, because this podcast is a spin-off of a 100-mile walk that I've been doing since 2012. And during COVID, I was not able to, I still walked, but I was not able to be accompanied by others. And I felt, kind of, it was great to walk, but I liked the talking as well while walking and listening. So that's how this podcast came about. So a question that I always had, and for my fellow walker, co-walker, was if you would be asked to walk 100 mile, in a week, in 5 days, for which cause or which reason would you walk? What drives you basically in life, right? Yeah.
I think that in the end, it would be about empathy. It would be about empathy, seeing the human in others. I mean, also understanding that everybody comes from a certain context and has ideas that you may disagree with, but still realizing that these ideas also come because of the specific context somebody grows up in, right? And that means seeing a human behind the opinions people have. So that I think a good cause for me would be a general one, and that would be to um to increase empathy in the world. Basically, I think that's a very important, and that requires listening as well to others, and being aware that there always is a human being and at the other at the end at the other end. I also that's maybe as you asked me earlier on, what is your trigger for doing this work on diversity and inclusion and racism? And I've been asked that question because I ask it myself as well, because I think sometimes, am I doing this also just to make a career? That should not be. I mean, of course, I'm also ambitious, but that should not be the right. But I have to ask myself this because I'm having an increasingly large network. I can work together with people. So maybe it's just a career. Well, actually, that is not, I think, the good reason to do this kind of work. So I'm asking myself this. And I think one of the fundamental things in the end for me is that we were all born in some part of the world, and some of us were lucky, and others were not so lucky, and are born in a world where there's hardship, where there's poverty, where there's hunger. And I think we should always realize that it's very much a matter of luck where you were born. And in the end, we are all equal in that sense. But it's just a matter. So when people are very much against, like, refugees coming in, I mean, we should think about also these things. That, yeah, I mean, you would have, if you would have been more unlucky, you would have been in that position, right? And then it would have been you. And empathy, that's why I mention here empathy as something that I would see as a good cause to walk for. Empathy can hopefully enhance this standing in others' shoes and being aware of the fact that, yeah, you could also have been in that other position. And I think that in general is also kind of a driver for the work I'm doing. I sometimes think that yeah, we can be a bit more aware of the fact that, yeah, we could have been in that position
Hmm.
just randomly by being born somewhere else. So that's, yeah.
Okay. We talked, about the inner development goals a lot, but actually you touched upon just now on issues like poverty, just injustice. Um, the IDGs were developed as a result of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Um, I have a quick question for you about that. Um, are there any, and there are seven, for my listeners, 17 goals, right? Working on a more just and sustainable world. Goal one, end poverty. Goal two, end hunger, etc. A result of a global discussion. Not perfect, but it's a framework that we are working on. So if you um, think about the sustainable development goals, are there any specific goals that resonate with your work on media, diversity, and representation? And how can games and media help or hinder their realization?
So the social, yeah, so the sustainable development, of course, the one that I think of now, because
Mhm.
they're most obvious to me, are the ones related to social justice and equity. I think that's one of the goals. I don't know them all. Like there's one on gender equity, if I'm
Mhm.
correct. So that
Goal
that
five, yeah.
resonates with my research. And of course, obviously, the yeah, ones that relate to racial inequity in particular. So, and how can media and gaming, yeah, contribute to that? Given the impact they have, the popularity they have amongst young people in particular, um, yes, they can have a lot of impact on contributing to these sustainable development goals, because there is a chance for that, for those industries like media industries, gaming industries, there's a chance to be self-reflective of how do we describe players of different countries. Right now, the Africa Cup of Nations is taking place, right? The football cup in Africa. It's also watched by many people. Gaming, like gaming communities, they talk a lot about different games. So I think, and it's also very much attractive to young people. So what happens in these spaces, and how can these spaces create inclusive spaces? I think, and that if they can do that, it's not that they need to change reality. They now don't have to be like counter stereotypical necessarily. Well, they should be counter stereotypical because stereotypes are just like generalizations. So that's not the best thing to do, right? But it's not that they have to make up a story, but as long as they are aware that they may create biases unconsciously, and if they are aware that they should combat those biases, if they do that, I think they create a more, yeah, equitable space that reaches a lot of young people. And in that sense, yes, it starts with young people. So in that sense, it's an informal learning site. It's education basically, but an informal form of education. And then, yeah, they can contribute, of course, to reduction of racial inequity, to reduction of gender inequity, and to improving social justice.
Okay. Maybe when you're trying to create these spaces where there is more inclusion, more people are involved, maybe the first steps within that is connection. And what I hope, to contribute to with this podcast is connecting people. We are connected, I connect you with the listener. I'm going to connect you with the previous guest. And the previous guest has a question for you. And the question is,
My question is, what event in your life made you act on something that you found unjust to achieve more justice?
Yeah, these questions are always, yeah, difficult in the sense that there are definitely events that contributed, but to think on the spot. So let me think. An event that happened in my life that triggered actions from my part to create more justice. Right? That's what is the question about? Yeah, I think what triggered me is when I sometimes shared research findings that showed that there is a subtle form of racism in, let's say, in sports media. When I share these findings with, sometimes, not always, but when I shared it with white male football commentators, for example, then it could happen that they became very resistant, and they basically did not want to hear about the findings that I had. And that, yeah, that triggers me because I it means that people are not open to potential. People take it very much on themselves. I mean, my criticism was not towards them as an individual. It's not that I told them that they are doing it themselves, that they are racially biased, or that their commentary is using stereotypes. I basically said that in general there was, yeah, racial stereotypes exist in sports commentary, and that it reaches a lot of people. And the defensiveness from that I got, that triggered me to dig deeper, to basically dig deeper also in the concept of, in my case, of whiteness. What does it mean, whiteness? There's a part of whiteness that doesn't want to see things, that doesn't want to see that there's maybe racism, also because it doesn't bother them really, or they have never experienced it. And that's kind of mindset, yeah, that triggered me to actually do more research on that, and also triggered me to, my gaming research, to also focus not only on doing research, but also move more into the intervention space. So how can we set up interventions to actually talk to people and make them more aware? So I did a lot of research in my career, but now I'm moving more also in the interventions. And
Yeah.
I think if you talk about actions that, yeah, that came out of something, then I think the trigger is the defensiveness, especially of white people in industries, and the action is moving more towards interventions and digging deeper.
Okay. Um, yeah, your question for the next guest.
Yes, my question. I think my question would be, um, what example can you give where you experienced also something in your life, can be personal life, can be work life, but that changed your course of action, that completely, not so much that inspires you to take action in your field, but that kind of you were in a certain trajectory in your work or in your private life, you were, had certain ambitions, but then you had to change course. And it can also be relatively small. It doesn't have to be a big life event. But what triggered that? And did it bring you something in the end that you did not expect in beforehand? That would be my question.
Okay, nice. I like it. Um, yeah, conversations always go fast, and I'm very cognizant of that you have another appointment to go to. I have one or two last questions, quick. This one is the most difficult one for many. And if I'm asking you to choose a song or a piece of music um, that represents for a big part what you are about, what Jacco is about, which song or piece of music would that be and why?
Yes. Well, I must say it's indeed difficult, but I did have very recently a conversation in the US actually with the professor that I visited in Michigan. This was, and when, so she brought me to the lecture hall with her car, and she asked me, the first I was in a car, she asked me, "What music do you like?" And I was completely surprised by that question. So indeed, you're completely right. It's a very difficult question. Uh, I mentioned something, but it wasn't my favorite song necessarily. But I thought I had to mention something. So I'm a bit more informed because of that. But the thing is that for me, music is very important, and it's very important for relaxation and for maybe also not thinking about anything else. So for being in that moment. The thing is that it is not so much about the specifically the text or whatever. So if you ask me, is there a song that represents you? Well, I don't have really an answer. I did think about this, and I think that there are two songs that kind of represent me. One is representative in the sense that it's very important to me. It's friends. It's close connections with friends around me. And then there is the song "Friend of Mine" from Avicii. Avicii is kind of interesting because Avicii is from Sweden. And when I was in Stockholm, when I met you in Stockholm in this IDG summit, I went to the Avicii Museum there, which was interesting to me because I like his music. So "Friend of Mine" is about friendship. So that's one song that says something about me. And if I may, there's a second one which is not so much about me, so you can also skip it for your own list. But um, it's called "Simple Song" from Passenger. Passenger is an artist I like a lot. And "Simple Song" is the title of a song that, as the title already says, it's just a simple song. It's not about anything, and that's what also what is music for me to a large extent. It's not so much necessarily about anything important or about me, not about me at all. Usually, it's just a simple song. It listens in a nice way. It gives me a good energy, and it gives me relaxation. So therefore, "Simple Song," yeah, is also something that I like.
Okay. I have allowed other guests also to pick more than one song. So I will add 2 new songs to a playlist on Spotify. If you go to #Walk Talk Listen, you will find all the songs that have been selected by my guests. Jacco, yeah, these conversations always go fast. As I said, I do have one last question for you. Um, is there any question that I did not ask you today that I should have asked you?
Not really, except perhaps that it's a lot about me, and this is in a way that's the idea of the podcast. It's about me, and hopefully listeners find it kind of interesting or they take something from it. I do want to emphasize that the work I'm doing, and we talk a lot about my work, it's really teamwork. And I have a team. I did refer to it in the beginning. It's a very diverse team coming from different countries, different racial, gender origins. So I do, even though I won't mention them by name, but I do want to, and it's not something you forgot, but it's something I think is important to mention because it's a lot about myself here. But yeah, the work, yeah, that I'm doing, and that's the reason probably you asked me for this podcast. It's in the end teamwork. So that's just one thing I want to add to the whole conversation.
Okay. And is there a website that they can check out to read more about
Yes,
your work, or have you read, written books that you recommend?
yeah. So our projects are on Prism Research. So Prism is Prism, PRISM, and then
Jacco meant prism-research.com.
and then you may get on different website because we have noticed that many are called Prism, but then you can also type in my name and then you come to our website and it has all the projects of our team. So I
Okay.
mean, if you're interested in gaming or the things we talked about today, yeah, that website would be the good place to go to.
Okay. We will mention that in the podcast notes. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the research that started then yesterday. You can keep us posted, and maybe we should have a follow-up conversation, maybe with your PhD candidate, because I'm really curious about that. Thank you so much for your willingness to talk with me today, for everything you do, for who you are, and yeah, keep that going. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Maurice. It was my pleasure. Very nice conversation. Thanks. Keep in touch.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.